Right. So thank you so much for joining in. And what I'm going to do is obviously look at covering Learning Outcome 2 today, which is for the Academic and Research Skills unit. Now, in this particular unit, as I mentioned very briefly last time, just to do a bit of a recap, the reason why we want to look at research is because in the health and social care sector in particular, we at sometimes, go into a questioning mode and we do a bit of introspection with patients, clients, or, people who are requiring care. And the idea there is on thereabouts is to try and find out about information about their medication, about their well-being, about their health. And this all is basically, looking at some sort of research, which is some sort of investigation you're doing before we make a case history. Now, in this particular unit, the idea of looking at studying this at level 3, which I mentioned in the first learning outcome in the introduction, was that here the main purpose is to help develop skills which could be useful when you go into higher education, things like academic writing, referencing, note-taking, and research skills. And the idea there is to build your abilities and skills to be able to do research, collect data. And this data can be collected from various sources, primary, secondary, and that is what we're going to go into in Learning Outcome 2. So with the first part of the learning outcome that we covered last time, what we looked at primarily was to, discuss about basically your strengths and weaknesses. And in this case, we looked at covering the idea of doing was to do a skills audit. And with this skills audit, the idea was to try and discover your skills and competencies or capabilities. And to a certain extent, what we also did was we extended that into what is called a SWOT analysis, so that you could identify your skills, hard skills or soft skills, personal or professional skills, and you can basically identify them as your strengths and weaknesses. And they then have to be related to your English language skills. So how good is your skill on reading, writing, listening, speaking, referencing, academic writing? And those are the areas that we wanted to look into in the first learning outcome. Now, depending on what you did in your SWOT, I've received that from Christina, and I see the document is quite detailed, and you've done it extremely well in terms of, looking at first doing a bit of an audit on your skills, and then later on you, put a plan together, which was also required to say that these are the areas wherein I have weakness, and I need to look at putting these activities in place in order to, sharpen my skills going further. The only bit which I would mention in that is that when we draw up a plan like that, what we also need to try and do is also at some stage put a bit of a timeline, because your plans, you don't want to draw up a plan which is going to be an open-ended plan. It is not a plan with infinite time that you can spend on it. So the idea there is to primarily also put a bit of a timeline. And that timeline allows you to essentially prioritize what kind of skills or, what kind of activities essentially you will undertake to improve the skills which are important in terms of the ranking that you've done, or in terms of, the SMART targets that you have set. So pretty nicely done. And I think the only bit which I would say is the timeline, you put some prices and some minutes and time that you would spend, but maybe slightly clear on that perspective in terms of a plan, because this is a living document when you make a personal development plan. And the idea thereabouts is to have a plan which could be reviewed by yourself, in months' time, 3 months' time, 6 months' time, and yearly, on a yearly basis. And then there were 1 or 2 websites that I suggested, primarily the BBC website or the IELTS website, in which you could go about and do your English audit in terms of your English language skills, take a screenshot of that, and obviously, put that as a proof that you've done, and whether your English in terms of that multiple choice question test, which the site offers, can be classed into beginners, intermediate, and advanced English. And that would be good to do a self-evaluation on the English language skills in particular. Now, in today's learning outcome, we are going to move that knowledge and the understanding that we've got from LO1 into learning outcome 2. And here today, what we are going to be looking at focused on learning is what is, say, for example, how do we collect information? Why is this information collected? And what is the use of this particular information? So in general, we are going to be talking about research. And here the idea would be to try and understand and differentiate between what is primary research and what is secondary research, and what are some of the methods that we use primarily to conduct this research. Or when I say research, I mean get hold of information. And that information at some stage, when it is synthesized, it is put into formats, or it is further worked on, can become knowledge. And knowledge is then used to make decisions at various levels. At your end personally, it could be at your supervisor's end, at your manager's end, by the management, and that is where synthesis of information happens into knowledge. Now, there are 3 assessment criteria in today's learning outcome, and they are focused on understanding, one, what is primary research, and what are the sources from which we can collect data firsthand. Primary means collecting data firsthand. Then we have the second one, which is talking about how do we carry out secondary research. That means data or information that you get once the event has happened or once the event has occurred. Then if you gather that information from a second source, or somebody telling you about that information, would be classed as secondary source. And that is what we will look at covering in secondary research. Then the third and the last assessment criteria in this is a distinction criteria, which talks about understanding with examples what constitutes good primary research and what constitutes good secondary research. So when you carry out these activities to collect data, information, you use different methods. So what would be the good methods or best methods in terms of practice when you are carrying out primary research or collecting data firsthand? And what would be these methods when you're collecting data secondhand, and they would be classed as secondary research. So a short learning outcome today, but the idea is this is something that we encounter and come across on a day in, day out basis. And it will be useful for us to understand and classify that when we look at data, information, knowledge, when we look at data points, how these data points are collected, how they can be categorized and classified as whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary, and what constitutes, or what are the best methods that we can use or employ, at least from a knowledge point of view today, to be able to understand that these are the methods that we can use primarily to collect data. Now, the reason I say this is that this particular learning outcome, if I just switch you back over for a second to the the unit specification, talks about know how to research. So here it is theoretical as a learning outcome. In the previous one, as you can see, it was be able to. That means you have to practically demonstrate. You have to do your SWOT analysis. You have to do your skills audit. You have to do your English test and take a screenshot, and you have to develop a plan. So it was be able to. That means you have to practically show. Here, it is a theoretical learning outcome wherein you need to know how research information is gathered through primary and secondary sources. So these are key descriptors that we need to follow and understand, so that you know when you produce an evidence, and the evidence which you produce is appropriate and meeting the guidelines and the criteria of the assignment brief. So when you do some of these practical learning outcomes, which are be able to or demonstrate, they would essentially be making sure that when I send you a template, you complete those templates and they will become a part of your assignment. So you are actually filling them up, and they are basically also contributing towards creating evidence for your assignment. Now let's look at this particular learning outcome theoretically. So some of the key terminology that will come across time and again, words that I pick out normally are, one is we are going to be using and overusing a word called research. So sometimes I will use research, sometimes I will use a connotation of that, which is data, information, and sometimes I will interpret it as knowledge. So research is one of the words that we need to know. And obviously, because the learning outcome is focused on the assessment criteria of it are focused on primary and secondary research and methods, we need to just generically know what they are. So in key terminology, what I want to do is understand what is research. Now, if I look at the definition, dictionary definition of the word research, it is systematic investigation. Now, what is systematic investigation? We are basically going to go into understanding some bits that are important to us and are going to go about, getting hold of that information in a structured manner, in a manner in which we know ins and outs about it. And that is where I would say it's a systematic investigation. One of the things which I'll give you an example of, very generic, would be that if I want to know how have I spent my last, say, 2 years or last 3 years during COVID pandemic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down, recollect some of the major events which have happened over the last 2.5, 3 years, and I'm going to structuredly write it down in a chronological order, which will basically tell me that, okay, this is how I spent my time during the COVID pandemic. Now, this, when you do it whereby writing down some bits and you try and order them in a particular order, you are going to be looking at doing this as a systematic exercise, as a very structured exercise. And that is why research is termed as, if you're looking at investigating into something in a systematic way, in a structured way, to try and find out the reasons behind or how you spent 2.5, 3 years during COVID pandemic, this is going to be termed as a research. You are revisiting some parts of the events that have happened in the past in order to recollect and document them, or maybe let's say remember them, and that process in a way would be termed as research. Now, if I expand that into primary and secondary research, and there is also something called tertiary research. So if I basically look at expand that into primary would be when you're trying to gather data which has not been collected before. That means you're going about doing that exercise for the first time. Like COVID pandemic hit, there was no data, no previous records available in terms of how the virus behaves, how it infects the human, and how it passes from one to the other. There was no particular data, information, knowledge available with any of the countries, any of the departments, any of the ministries of health, or, for example, major, let's say, institutions which were basically the first responders to dealing with COVID. Now, in this case, the data which was structuredly and systematically gathered, symptoms which the patients begin to show, how the virus develops, what kind of complication it leads to, helped in better understanding to deal with the virus. And this, because the data wasn't available, it wasn't collected before, and it was collected for the first time, this is termed as primary research. And the reason why this was documented in great detail by each and every organization or institution involved in dealing with the COVID pandemic across different countries, continents, was done in a way which helped develop the process of development of the vaccines that we see today, which have become effective. And even today, when new variants of Omicron are coming through, the documentation of how and when and how does it affect and what kind of symptoms it causes is also being documented because of the fact that this data has not been gathered before. So that is why it is primary research. Now, when we look at the second option, which is secondary research is basically research which is compiled or gathered or organized when data is already published and available. So if I ask you, one of you, to go in and look at compiling some data on, say, for example, how has the COVID pandemic affected in terms of fatalities in the last 2.5 years. So what you're going to be able to do is go on to Google. You would probably research or search some websites which have some details about patients which have been infected, patients which have been cured, patients which unfortunately did not make it, or were deaths which were caused by the COVID pandemic. And what you're going to be able to do is compile that data from various websites for various countries, and then publish or basically compile that into a report. And that would be basically research that you would have done because you've gathered data which has already been published elsewhere. So when I say published elsewhere, what I mean by that, either it's been published on print, it's been published digitally, or there are records which are available now in libraries or journals or articles. And what you're looking at is referring to them or some of the government agencies which have compiled this data to basically collect it together for the purposes of your own investigation, and that would be termed as what is called secondary research. So the main difference between primary and secondary research tends to be, primary is data which has not been collected, or you collect data firsthand by, say, for example, questionnaires, by surveys, by feedback surveys. And secondary data tends to be data which is basically published on different domains, either digitally or in print, or otherwise in archives and various other institutions which basically gather data, collect data, and basically publish let's say, process that data and then publish it. And you are utilizing those sources to be able to gather data for your own research or investigation. That would be termed as secondary research. So, for example, there are lots of organizations in the world like IDC, International Data Corporation, Gartner. You have various retail consortiums which publish lots of data, across the world. And they are organizations which collect data from various sources. And their main aim is to collect data and to compile that data into information and then into reports. And those are which, Mintel, for example, Cantor, these are such organizations in the UK and in Europe and in the wider context, which basically collect data and then sell this data, which then is used by companies, organizations, business intelligence departments, marketing research departments to compile and create reports which are going to be specific for them and their organization. And that is where the compilation of this data is, when it is done through published sources, would be termed as secondary research. I'll also introduce very briefly one other form, which is called the tertiary research. Now, tertiary research basically means, anybody in terms of the meaning of the word tertiary? Do you know what is the meaning of the word tertiary? Okay, when we look at the meaning of the word tertiary, what we mean by that, if I look at, it basically means third, or the third, level. So, for example, primary is first, secondary second, and then tertiary would be third. So, tertiary is basically, when we look at the tertiary research, what we mean by that is data which can be gathered or sources which will allow you to gather data which could be coming either from primary or secondary sources, and they can be then used to compile information or knowledge which is required for your decision making, would be termed as tertiary research. So, for example, if I look at an assignment and towards the end of the assignment, you've developed a referencing list or a bibliography, then in those cases, if I use that list to basically refer to some of the sources from where you've compiled or gathered that information, then I would be looking at doing a tertiary research, because some part of your assignment will have primary evidence because you're writing it for the first time, you're researching it and writing it. Secondary would be you're writing and reading something from websites, journals, articles, books, and then you're writing in your own words or paraphrasing, and they would be secondary. Now, if I look at as a person and I look at the bibliography and try and go back and look at some of the sources from which you have compiled this, and I try and identify and locate those primary and secondary resources, which could be abstracts that you've done or quotations that you've used in your assignment, they would be termed as tertiary research. And they could be coming from multiple formats. So it could be online, it could be print, and that is why this would be termed as something called, tertiary research. So let me put this here as well, just in context, so that when you refer to the presentation, you would be, obviously aware that there are three types of research collection techniques or methods. One is primary, secondary, and the third is tertiary. Now, let's go into a bit more detail, in the assessment criteria. The first one, which is primary versus secondary research. So as I've explained to you that when we talk about primary research, we are looking at collecting data firsthand. Now, when we look at collecting data firsthand, how do we look at the methods? So the first learning outcome talks about describe the process of carrying out primary research from different sources, or what are the methods from which you would go about using primary research and collect data. Now, this is primarily done through focus groups, surveys, interviews, feedback surveys, as we do questionnaires, and they tend to be wherein you would then give this questionnaire out or give a survey out to the person, and they would then fill it in, and then at some stage later on it will be all collated, compiled, and then essentially data from that would be extracted. A simple example that I would give you here is, imagine a patient which has gone to a hospital and has received a bit of care or has undergone an operation, and after, at some stage when the patient gets discharged, you would generally see that the patient is served a questionnaire or a feedback questionnaire. And the reason why a feedback questionnaire is served to the patient is that the hospital and the services, the staff which has provided lots of different types of services to the patient, they want to get feedback on those services from the patient firsthand. So in terms of what kind of care did you receive, was the care adequate, were things like your professional, let's say, Was there professionalism in terms of providing this care? When we look at the 6 elements of person-centered care, things like privacy was adhered to. Were the staff sympathetic towards you? Were they, willing to help you? Basic areas in which they would want to get and improve. When I say they would want to get, I mean the hospital would want to get feedback on from this patient, and then look at improving their standards further in terms of providing customer services or meeting quality compliance, which has been laid down by CQC. They would be looking at serving this questionnaire to the patient. And this is generally something that you get to see. For example, if you go out on a holiday, you stay at a hotel, and when you're checking out, typically the receptionist or the concierge would essentially serve you a feedback questionnaire. And the reason they would want to collect this feedback is basically they want to improve their services. But because they're serving this questionnaire or asking you to fill this up firsthand, it could be done through, they might send you a link on the website saying, thank you for visiting us. And, would you be happy to spend 2 minutes on a questionnaire? Sometimes these things are now being done today on the mobile phone. When if you speak to somebody on British Gas or one of the call center services on your mobile phone, they normally say, would you be happy to take a short survey just after the phone call? And what they do is they send you text first saying, were you happy with the service? Rank it on 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Then the second you reply, the second question pops up, and the third question and the fourth question, and so on and so forth. Now, because this is data or information being sought from you personally as a user, and it is coming to you and being asked from you firsthand, would be termed as primary. Now, various methods through which primary research can be done. There are a few methods. So you can do observations. Sometimes you see when we talk about, nursing, for example, or when you're working and you see a new, say, healthcare assistant which has joined the team, or a new nurse has joined the team, or a new doctor, when we talk about the associate doctors, when they undergo training and they are basically, taking rounds. So what they do is they are with a consultant. They are basically going round and meeting patients, but how they are learning and collecting data, writing down, is they're doing observations in terms of how the consultant is dealing with the patient. Sometimes you do the nurses, the lead nurse or the most experienced practice nurse would take the other nurses who are under training onto a ward round, and what they would look at doing is they would look at asking you to do observations in terms of how you deal with patients, what kind of things have to be done, how do you look at the patient record, update it, sign it. You might look at doing some basic checks like blood pressure, bloods, other things like administrating medicine, and checking basic things. And this would be a method through which you would look at observation. Then there are surveys that I've talked about. I've given you an example of an interview related survey. Sometimes when you buy something, or when you participate and you agree that I would be happy to give feedback, that feedback process could happen through a telephonic survey or an interview as well. Most of it has moved to online today. So when you get services, when you buy something from Amazon, you buy something, from a favorite store of yours, most of them now send you electronic receipts, and obviously they ask you to participate in a short survey. And this is them collecting data firsthand. Sometimes we do focus groups and interviews. So you would see, for example, when an electoral register is created, sometimes people come to your doorstep to basically discuss and talk to you. And in those cases, they are collecting information face-to-face, and they would be termed as what are called face-to-face surveys. Sometimes you attend a training or a seminar, and what happens is your trainer group puts you into a group to ask you to discuss something, and the trainer would come and then observe how the group is working through that problem or the task which has been given. The trainer would then be doing what is called observation, and then make some notes that, okay, this is a pertinent point, this is an important point they've discussed. And in some cases, they are asking you to discuss as a group and come out with a solution which you are going to present in the seminar or in the training. And they would be termed as focus groups. So you would see data which primarily is collected firsthand from the source, and there are lots of different methods of collecting that. So this would be observations, surveys. Surveys could be done through postal surveys, telephonic interviews, online surveys, face-to-face surveys, and then sometimes you have interviews and focus groups which are done wherein you want the information firsthand, but you want to do open-ended. You have a lot of open-ended questions that you want to check. So, for example, you want to interview, say, a store colleague. If I give you an example in retail, and if I look at a patient in particular in a care home, sometimes you would see that CQC when they visit or inspections when they happen, what they will try and do is they will try and meet up with a few patients and ask them detailed questions about the service. That when do you get your breakfast, who helps you in bathing, or your change of clothes, how often the sheets are changed, how often is your room hoovered. And these are open-ended questions which they might be looking at doing detailed investigations into, and they are basically the route through which you would look at interview techniques being used to collect data. And these are all techniques that you would generally see which can require people to visit the place where the data has to be collected. This particular type of research can also be a bit expensive to do because you have to collect everything by seeing the person or meeting the person and spending time, because you're collecting some of this at the source and maybe for the first time. And in some cases, this could also involve longer duration of time for the collection to happen. So if a training event happens once in 3 months, obviously there's a time interval involved, and obviously then only the HR department or maybe the management will be able to collect this feedback. So it can happen over a period of time, and that is why sometimes if we relate this method of collecting information to costs, we would generally see that primary methods of collection of information tend to be much more expensive and time-consuming than secondary or tertiary methods. Now, if you look at the reverse second side of the learning outcome, which talks about, outline the processes for carrying out secondary research from different sources. Secondary research is also termed as what I call desk-based research, because you're actually looking at collecting data that already exists. And what you're looking at doing is you're collecting it from various sources, which could be either sources wherein the information has already been published by other organizations. So in this case, when I talk about secondary data, there are various methods through which you can collect data. And this data could be sometimes when management looks at, how the care home has been performing, and if the Ofsted rating or the CQC rating, say, has been good, above average, excellent, or, basically there are 4. Not meeting the criteria, you have average, above average, and you have good. Now, if the rating has to be checked, what was the rating last year? So basically, there is a report available. You access that report and you're able to get data for the last year in terms of rating. Now, if you are to compare the last 3 years of how the audit and the compliance has been met and the reports have been, the nursing home or the care home has been graded, and what grades or, performance-wise they have been given during the inspection, you can actually go down and, from the website, look at the last 3 years report, and you're able to get that data. So because this information is available, from a variety of different sources, which is either published by the organization itself or compliance bodies or CQC website from which you can get hold of this, that is why this information is going to be termed as secondary information. And sometimes this is also called desk-based research. On the flip side, primary research is also called field research, because you have to go and see the person, meet the person, maybe go to the outlet or go to the nursing home, care home, hospital, and then speak to the patient, client, customer, whichever way you call it, and then collect that data. That is why it is also called field-based research. Now, secondary sources of information can be collected from various sources. So when we talk about secondary sources of information can come from market research organizations. It can come from, and when I talk about market research organizations, have you come across any market research organizations in particular? Have you heard about any market research organizations in general? Any idea? Okay, if you've not come across market research organizations, that's fine. But generally what you would see is that when we talk about the secondary research, a lot of this data is collected through, various types of organizations, which could be organizations like Mintel, which is basically a global market research firm, and it publishes data for different sectors, of the industry. It could be retail, construction, pharmaceutical, medicine, things like that. You also have agencies like Euromonitor International, and Euromonitor International would be, organizations which basically publish syndicated market research, from various cities, in particular 1,200 cities in Europe and across, not just in Europe, but other continents, but about 210 countries. And then you have other organizations which I've mentioned, which are organizations like Gartner and, IDC, and they basically tend to, publish data specifically with regards to, various sectors within the industry. Now, if we talk about health and social care, what are the various organizations that collect data and actually provide, data in terms of research? So if I have to look at this, then one of the first organizations which I would say which helps us do that is the National Institute of Health and Social Care. Now, this is NIHR. Now, this institute is the largest funder of health and care, social care research in UK. And it basically collects a lot of data related to patient records, service level standards, various organizations. And this is a useful website which you can visit. And this website specifically provides a lot of reports, information which is gathered and published for the purposes of, health and social care. Now, there are other organizations like the King's Fund. There are organizations which are within this particular sector, and these organizations also, gather information and publish it for the purposes of research. And just to briefly show this to you, so that we can place a bit of a context to it. If I share the website just for reference purposes. So when I mention organizations like Mintel, they are global research organizations which basically publish reports, across various sectors. So you can buy the reports, and these are across sectors. When I say across 15 different sectors like automation, beauty, healthcare, clothing, consumer, health and well-being, things like that. Euromonitor, similar research organization which publishes research across 1,200 cities in 210 countries. And again, this is a paid research site. So large organizations like the National Health Service, Age UK Charity, some of the other large organizations like, they would be, for example, might be subscribing to this research because they might get useful information about how things are developing within this sector. Then when we talk about specifically health and social care research, the National Institute of Health and Care Research is an organization which basically is focused on healthcare professionals. They are basically focused on patient records, delivery of services within the NHS, and that tends to provide a lot of information related to health and social care. Then we talk about King's Fund. Again, this is a registered charity in England and Wales. Obviously, it collects a lot of information about health and social care and the national health services which the NHS provides to members of the public. And they publish a lot of different types of reports which can be useful for the purposes of secondary research. Now, there are the reasons of understanding that why we do research and why is it important is because we are looking at gathering information which can help us to make future decisions or help in the future decision making. It could help us improve services, improve quality standards, and that is why information is gathered, whether it's field-based research, desk-based research, or in some cases when I say tertiary research, which could be a combination of primary and secondary methods, which will allow us to gather this information for the purposes of say decision making, or in some cases knowledge that we are looking at. Now, in order to ensure that we have understood what is primary research and what is secondary research, what I'm going to try and do is basically do a bit of a slideshow and see if you are able to recognize what are the various methods or what kind of information is this particular method actually portraying. So let's look at this particular slideshow. So here you can unmute your microphones, and what I would ask you to do is basically identify whether this is primary, secondary, or tertiary, and then give me a reason why do you think this is primary, secondary, and tertiary. So let's look at the first image. So this is a picture or a portrait that you see. So is this primary? Is this secondary? Is this tertiary?
Primary.
Okay. And why do you think this is primary?
It's the first one you're showing. It's the first information.
All right, okay. So let's look at whether this is primary, secondary. So this is primary because somebody as an artist has created this portrait, and because you're seeing it firsthand, that is why it is primary.
Yeah.
Let's look at the second one. So this is the cover of a book.
There's a secondary one.
It's a secondary one.
All right, okay. So this is secondary because Anne Frank, and it's a biography. So somebody would have, one of the authors would have written the biography, which is Anne Frank of Melissa Muller. And obviously, because you're reading it secondhand as a published book, that is why it is secondary.
Yeah.
This is like a classified advert, which has been published in a paper. So an extract of a classified advert. Is this primary, secondary, or tertiary?
It's a tertiary.
Okay, so one of you said tertiary, one of you said?
It's tertiary.
It's tertiary, yeah.
So this, if you read the advert carefully, is primary because it says,
primary.
Yeah, it is primary because this is, let's say, an advert which has been published by a company. So what they've done is they've published an advert to, say, popularize something or advertise something. And because the advert was published and you picked up a newspaper and you're reading it firsthand to make yourself aware of the advert, or what they've said is ingenious in many considerable ways of the world, and this is volume 1, this is termed as primary.
Okay.
Now, this is an almanac, which is primarily taken out from an archive. Is this primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Taken from archive, it will be primary then.
No.
Oh, sorry, it will be secondary. Sorry.
It will be secondary because information that we.
So first, when you said it is primary, which is correct, because you are, this is something which has been pulled out from an archive and you are seeing it firsthand. So it is primary. So you were correct on that. Now, when somebody said tertiary, why is it tertiary? Because this was published.
It's a source that will allow us to gather information. It was published and it's from.
Correct. So it's published in 1875. It is an archive, and obviously we have pulled it out. And because it has been published and archived, so when it was published, and if you watched it or you got hold of it in 1875 on the day it was published, it would have been secondary. But because it has been pulled out from an archive, which would mean it is a soft copy or something which has been scanned and saved, that is why it is tertiary. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's look at the next one. So this is a book, a picture of a book that you see.
It's a secondary.
Okay. When you say a book and you pick it up for the first time, because when you're looking at a book, now this does not say biography. Again, the author is the same, Anne Frank, but this does not say biography. This is a book. So maybe a novel. But it is, when you pick it up for the first time for reading, this is primary. Okay. Chart.
Sorry, whilst you are there.
Yeah, go on.
Whilst you are on the book. So for us to be able to differentiate whether this book is a secondary, because I thought any book, any journal, any website, it's secondary. So if we are picking it, you said if we are picking it from the first time to read and it doesn't say biography, that will be primary.
That is correct. So if a primary source is defined as it's a first-hand record of an event or a topic that has been created and you're picking it up in the form of book. So primary sources could also be letters, eyewitnesses, accounts. It could be diary, article, book, recording, statistical data. It could be a manuscript, and they will all be termed as primary because you are looking at them firsthand as a record.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So if I pick up a journal or if I pick up a diary that you have maintained and I start picking and reading up that diary, that would also be termed as primary because though you're writing it, but I am reading it. But if I look at it from an events point of view, what kind of events does it show or portray? Yes, I would also say it is secondary because I'm reading somebody's events that have been documented, as far as that is concerned. Is that okay?
Yes.
So if I go into the next one, we are looking at, a chart which basically shows some information in terms of, say, in yen, it is a Japanese chart which is showing some sort of graph. What is it? Primary information, secondary or tertiary?
I should think it should be tertiary.
Okay. Why do you think it is tertiary?
Because it's something that it's printed. It's from, hold on. So it's from a Japanese event.
It's a website, yes. But if you look at it in a bit more detail, if it was just a plain chart with some figures, but not these moving lines, assuming I know it is a bit old, but because it is showing a timeline here, and what you're seeing is they are moving lines which are shown. So maybe if it was a stock market chart, when you're in the stock market or when you're seeing it on television and they are showing you live changes on the currency yen, how is it going up and down? Will you class it as primary?
Or secondary?
It's secondary.
It's somebody's information.
Because we got a year, that it was gathered.
I've used the word live. So if you assume this chart was live and these lines were moving, would you class it as primary? What would you class it as? Because it is live and you're witnessing it live on the TV. Okay. Assuming you're watching it and these lines are moving.
Yeah, we're witnessing for the first time, but somebody's putting that information on. So that will be primary and secondary. So that information, primary and secondary, so that will be tertiary because we're gathering from the first time and somebody's information being put on.
Correct. So it can be classed
as online.
Primary.
It's happening online. Yeah. Yes. Live.
Correct. So if I was showing you this to you live, it will be primary. Because you're witnessing it on a published website, it is secondary. And because I've compiled it and put it onto a PowerPoint presentation, obviously the reference to the dates is in the back in the history, 2010. That is why it is tertiary. Okay, so well done. So basically this chart, the idea of showing this chart was that you should be able to differentiate depending on the situation and the circumstance in which you see this information, whether it's primary, secondary or tertiary. So if you were seeing it live, maybe standing in a stock exchange where it is primary, that will be primary. If you see it on television being broadcasted as news, that would be secondary. And if you're now seeing it on the presentation, which I'm showing you, and this is not moving and it's not live, then in this case, this is going to be termed as tertiary.
Tertiary.
Okay, good stuff. So essentially, this particular slideshow was, done to basically make you understand that some parts of it in terms of how do we look at classifying whether the information is primary, secondary or tertiary. Now, if I show you this cover of the book which says History of Television, is this primary, secondary?
This will be secondary because it's history.
That is correct. Absolutely. It is secondary because it is history. Let's look at the next one. This is a website. So is it primary, secondary?
It's tertiary because it's a website and it's not moving. Like it's something that's, I think, collected. I don't know.
Assuming if I was showing you a live website, like I showed you for Mintel or any,
it will be a primary. If it is live, it's primary.
Any other answer?
No. So because from what they've written there is saying this week, last week, week before. So there's a collation of work of different things. Somebody put it together. That's tertiary because there's a first time there, and there's the putting it together and combining everything. All the three of them put together will be tertiary.
Correct. So it can be termed as tertiary, but looking at just the snapshot of the website, if I'd taken it now, and because it says you captured it well, because it says this week, last week, and the week before, it is primarily depicting events which have already happened. And it is basically portraying events in the past. So that is why I would say it is secondary. And let's look at a number of papers that we get to see. If you see these papers, newspapers, what are these going to give? So newspaper is published information. And this is where you interpret what you were interpreting for the website. If you pick it up, it is secondary because the events and other things that is describing has already happened. If this paper was something that you picked up from an archive, it will become tertiary. But if you are the editor and writing and you're getting hold of the first prints, which are going to the shops in the morning and you are picking it up, then this would be primary because you are the editor who's basically seeing the information firsthand being published on the paper.
Yes.
That's great. So let's look at one or two last. So if I look at magazines.
Magazines.
Yeah, these are magazines. So primary, secondary?
Secondary.
Okay, great. So it is primary if you're seeing it, if it's the current issue of the month. So for example, if I pick up a Reader's Digest, or if I pick up, say, News Weekly, and if it is for the month of June, it is primary because the information is current. But if I pick it up, if I pick a June issue and I'm in the month of July and I pick up an issue of, say, for example, I'm in June, if I pick up an issue of February or January or May, then it will be secondary because it is an older issue that I'm picking up and that's why it is secondary. But as long as the information remains current in that month, that would be termed as primary.
Primary.
Correct. Okay, this is a handwritten, note given by, say, Elvis Presley to the American Airlines. What would this be classed as?
This is primary.
Primary.
All right. This is primary because this is a note written by Elvis Presley to one of the flight attendants, and she is got that note firsthand. It is primary, correct. So with this particular slideshow, it gives you a very good idea in terms of what material is termed as primary when you have originality, when it is collected firsthand, when it is collected from field-based sources. Secondary tends to be when you are basically collecting data from desk-based research, published reports, various websites, or in places wherein you have picked this up, not in the current month, but you're reading something or you're getting hold of something which is on the basis of accounts, somebody telling you or narrating about it. And the tertiary tends to be the collection of both. It could refer to both primary and secondary, wherein basically that is material or information which has already been published, and it could be archived. You're collecting it from either a primary or a secondary source, and depending on how you pick it up, whether it's print, whether it's digital, whether it's coming out from an archive, that would be primarily termed as tertiary. Is that okay?
Yes.
So with this, we cover today's learning outcome in the assessment criteria, which was focused on, understanding what are various, areas of research. How do we look at information, whether we class them as primary, secondary, and tertiary, although is not mentioned, but it's good to know what is tertiary as well. And then we know what are the various methods through which primary, secondary, research data can be collected. And then we have done a bit of a quiz or a slideshow to analyze what are the best practices or through which we have understood how do we differentiate between primary and secondary research. And we've looked at a few in terms of identified areas that we need to be focused on when we are differentiating the sources of information coming from, places. Now, there are two good articles which I would suggest that you need to read just to crystallize your understanding in terms of primary and secondary. And I'll show these to you now so that you are able to go in and read these one-page, articles primarily to, understand what is primary and what is secondary, sources of research. So let me just switch you over to Google. 1 second. So here we go. So when you look at this particular two sites that I put on, talk about what is primary research methods, because we need to be focused on when we do the assignment, it says carry out primary research from different sources. What are the methods? So these are various methods that we look at for primary research, 1 page, 2 minute, 3 minute reading. And then we talk about secondary research. Then this is also a 2 to 3 minute reading to try and identify what do we class as secondary methods, for collection of data specifically related to the assessment criteria 2.2. And they will be useful for putting a bit more information of what you've gathered today with me on the presentation. So any questions on today's topic so far?
No, fine. Just read up and there, of course, get understanding more.
All right. Okay. That's great, Christina. Sam and Jefferson, I know you joined a bit late in the session, so I'll make sure you get copies of recording, but do you have any questions on this so far?
No, not this one. Last time you told me to send some documents on email, but I couldn't find any on my email. I don't know if you get my email.
I will send that across to you today, which was basically a template to do SWOT analysis and a SMART targets template and a small PDP template, which was to develop a personal development plan. I'll send it to you again now. I got your email, so I'll reply to it with these 3 attachments.
Okay, thanks. Sorry for joining late today because I was.
Can you send it to my mail too?
I will send it to you as well, Samuel. No worries. I'll send both of them the same template.
And myself also, please, Sakani, Gertrude.
No worries, Sakani. What I'll do is I'll forward that email on again. I think some of you have missed out on the email because I wasn't very clear who all are on this, but I will send it to you just after the session. So you should get it in the next 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so this presentation and the copy of the recording presentation will go up on Moodle, and the copy of the recording I'll post as soon as it's available in about, I would say, 15 to 20 minutes, so that you can catch up, and then we'll meet up for the 3rd learning outcome next week. Okay.
Yeah, otherwise I thought you said we're going to have 2 sessions.
We will try and have 2 sessions next time, because the learning outcome 3 is just 2 assessment criteria, and learning outcome 4 is also 2 or 3 assessment criteria. So we're going to combine the next session, which will have LO3 and LO4, and then after that we'll combine LO5 and LO6, because LO6 has only just 2 assessment criteria, so it will be a very short session. So the next sessions are going to be combined to wrap up the unit. When I say combined, we will have 1 session covering next week for LO3 and LO4, and a session after that for LO5 and LO6.
Yeah, sorry, with due respect, the notice today was a bit short. I was on my way out to church when I had to come back, because I didn't know we're going to have it at 9 a.m. this morning.
No, that's fine. What we are going to do is the session timings are fixed at 10 a.m. Today I changed it to 9. Reason being that I have some, an additional tutorial. So I wanted to slot that in, and that starts at 10. So what I did was I changed it for today. So sorry for the short notice as my end. I should have informed that, I'm changing it, but we are going to have it at 10 o'clock. And obviously the next session that we do at 10 o'clock, might be about an hour and a half, 2 hours, because we're combining 2 learning outcomes, and the subsequent session will also be, of that duration.
Yeah, that's fine. Once we know, it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining, and I will catch up with you next time. Okay. If you have any questions in the meanwhile, or if you come up with any questions, feel free to, email them over, and they can be sent across to LearnerWork, and I'll pretty much, come back with more details or, responses to your queries. But enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll catch up with you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm kindly asking for assignment brief, please.
Yes, I will send that to you. I think what we are going to do is, after we complete LO5, LO6, we are also going to have a discussion on the assignments, brief. So that will be called an assignment discussion session. So we'll discuss the full assignment for the unit. What you have done, because in some places in LO4 and in LO5, I'm also going to share a template, and they will be used to fill those templates up, and they will become a part of your assignment. So in this unit, 50% of the work that you're doing, if you do it after the session has happened and with the template that I supply, that will go towards 50% of contribution of your assignment. The balance is theoretical, and those are the bits that we will discuss, but that will be a separate session wherein we'll discuss the assignment brief in great detail, so that you know exactly how it is to be done, what has to be compiled, and you do it right the first time, and you are able to hit the grade that you're trying to achieve.
Thank you.
Okay. No worries.
Thank you,
Take
sir.
care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.
Yes.